Hi, Andrea.
Hey Lisa,
How are you?
I am doing well. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. So, um, so thanks for sending your bio.
Sorry, it was totally last minute.
That's fine. No, I was like, I just wanted to make sure that I had something to introduce you with because if you like it, now I'm gonna let her tell you everything about her because I don't have anything. Um, so your talk seems really interesting. I'm looking forward to hearing you speak. So just I'm sure you know how this works. I just wanted to like go through some stuff with you to just make sure that you're cool with everything. And again, it's up to you. You're the presenter. Typically, we ask people to keep their cameras off during your presentation and kind of type their questions in as you're talking so they're not interrupting you. However, it's up to you. Some presenters are like, no, that's fine. They can ask me questions while I'm in. What's your preference? Would you rather have them held to the end, or are you okay to have people interrupt you? What's
They can interrupt me. It's
okay?
always probably more interesting that way.
Okay. Okay, yeah. Sometimes that throws people, and sometimes people are okay with that. So we'll go ahead and just and tell them to do that. We'll ask them to keep their cameras off unless they have a question, just because then they become a disembodied head on the YouTube video, which ends up looking weird. So I'll go ahead and introduce you and welcome you, and then I'll go through your bio, and then I'll hand it off to you, do the presentation. I'm going to keep my camera off until the end, so all the focus is on you. I'll also be monitoring the chat for any questions that people have. And then at the end we'll just wrap it up. You're okay with this being recorded then too, I'm
Oh yeah,
assuming.
that's totally fine.
Okay, good deal.
And
All right,
is the slot it's 12 to 1.
12 to 1, yeah.
Okay. And I'll
And do you
speak
want
for
to go
like
ahead and share your slides just so we can make sure that that works instead of like just in case, because I don't want to start like
something, it's always something.
it's yeah, I know. Yep.
Um okay. I will see. I have 75 slides.
Okay.
Um that feels like a lot, but I also think I'll like some of them I'll go through pretty quickly.
Okay. That
So
sounds good. All
so yeah,
right.
if you want to just, I was gonna get my maybe say like I'm guessing we want to leave like 5 or 10 minutes for questions at the end.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
I mean, I think 10 minutes is usually good. Sometimes we have people typing them in as you're presenting, and I can certainly read those to you at the end. And then, but yeah, usually 10 minutes is
mhm.
plenty for questions. So yeah, if
Okay,
that works for you.
yeah, that's good.
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, I'll go ahead and turn my camera off, and I'm going to go ahead and start letting people in the room. If unless you have any other
Yeah,
questions, or anything.
nope, that sounds good.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. All right.
Oops.
Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Uh, Welcome, everyone. Hello and happy Friday the 13th to those who are superstitious about this phenomenon and to those of us who realize this day-to-day juxtaposition is just a temporal combination that happens approximately 1.7 times every year. So welcome to another episode of University of Florida's College of Design, Construction, and Planning Research Seminar Series. I'm Lisa Sundahl-Platt, and I'll be the host for today's session. We are very lucky we have another really great speaker for today's presentation, Professor Andrea Galinski. Welcome, Professor Galinski.
Thank you, Lisa.
So Andrea's talk today is on exploring opportunities for climate adaptation in Florida's coastal communities, a case study of Cedar Key. Andrea is an assistant professor in the landscape architecture department, as well as a research affiliate with the UF Schimberg Center for Housing Studies. Andrea's research explores the nexus between climate change and affordable housing. Her research has been supported by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, Gulf Research Program, the National Science Foundation, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, Florida Sea Grant, and the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, and others. Previous to her time here at UF, Andrea worked at the Louisiana Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority to develop the state's 50-year, $50 billion coastal master plan to protect and restore the coast in the context of a changing climate. She also taught at Louisiana State University, LSU, focusing on research-based design of coastal landscape infrastructure. Andrea has a Master of Landscape Architecture from Louisiana State's Robert Reich School of Landscape Architecture, as well as a transdisciplinary Bachelor of Philosophy degree in Human Ecology from Penn State University. A fun factoid about Andrea is that she loves traveling and has been to places like India, Thailand, and Kenya, Italy, Japan, and others. She also, this is so cool, she also met the Dalai Lama when she was in Dharamshala, which, let me just say, OMG, how cool are you, Andrea? That is really amazing. I love that. You and Richard Gere, verified company. So I'll be fielding any questions you have for Professor Galinski by monitoring the chat, which will be answered at the end of her presentation. However, double check with Andrea if you have a burning question amid her presentation. She indicated she's totally fine with you unmuting yourself to ask that question. Since we are recording, though, and we'll be posting this to the DCP YouTube page, if you are not asking a question and wouldn't mind to keep your cameras off and stay muted during Professor Galinski's presentation, that would be most appreciated. So without further delay, we will now welcome Professor Andrea Galinski to begin her presentation.
Thank you, Lisa. I really appreciate that warm welcome. And I also really appreciate your very technical framing of this potentially lucky, unlucky, or none of the above Friday the 13th. So thank you all for joining us today. I am going to speak about some exciting opportunities for climate adaptation in Florida's coastal communities with a focus on a current project that we're doing in Cedar Key. So to give you all just a quick overview of what I will discuss today, I'll give a quick introduction and framing for my particular area of interest, which really is, as Lisa mentioned, at this nexus of affordable housing and flood hazards. And then I will go into some depth about our project in Cedar Key, which is focused on two parts: a vulnerability assessment and then the development of some adaptation areas and actions. As we all know, Hurricane Idalia was a big event for us this few weeks ago, and that has also affected our project in Cedar Key, both unfortunately causing negative impacts, but also potentially opening up the door to some new changes and new opportunities. And then I'll let you know about a workshop we have coming up that you would all be cordially welcome to attend, and have some question and answers at the end. And again, if you do have a burning question, I'm happy to answer it along the way. So I do a lot of my research affiliated with the UF Schimberg Center for Housing Studies. Some of you may be familiar with the center, others may not. It is located in the Brinker School of Construction Management. It was established a number of years ago to really focus on our key issues of affordable housing around the state. The center focuses on doing research, providing a lot of kind of data and information through its clearinghouse. We produce a number of publications, both statewide and for local governments. And I think all of our work is really underlined on our commitment to public service. And then within the UF Schimberg Center, I think that affordable housing really touches upon many, many issues, health, climate change, et cetera. One of the more recent initiatives that we've been developing is the Disaster Resilient Florida initiative that focuses on how climate hazards like heat, like flood risk, affect affordable housing, and how can we provide more actionable data, visualization tools that help people harness and take advantage of this data, and how can we kind of do community outreach to get this information in the hands of local decision makers and community members that can make the most of it. And so this initiative really focuses on that intersection of housing, disaster preparedness, and resiliency planning. Some other aspects that we support are community-driven research projects. We fund some studio course development, as well as graduate and undergraduate independent research projects around these themes. And so just to set some kind of background framing, I am super passionate about these issues, and think that looking at Florida's flood hazards, our evolving climate risk, dealing with the impacts of disasters, currently, there's a really unique lens that I think we can look at all of this through, it being housing and affordable housing systems. I think that it is a unique window into kind of understanding how we are not necessarily all equally affected by flood risk and other climate hazards. For example, homes that are in lower income areas are often more likely to be in poor physical condition, older, or not properly maintained, which can make them vulnerable to the impacts of flood hazards, for example. And then another example, particularly focused on subsidized housing, these homes are occupied by low-income residents by definition, and they're also disproportionately elderly, and many are people of color. And so that also kind of illustrates how not only may the physical structure be, say, more vulnerable, the people living within the home as well are also more socially vulnerable. And so just to kind of further expand on this theme of affordable housing, at the Schimberg Center, we often focus on renter households. I think it is an area that could use more research and exploration, and how this characteristic can lead towards general more vulnerability to disaster impacts across the entire disaster cycle. So from preparedness to impact to emergency response and recovery, I think there is a real opportunity to think about how renters, for example, are vulnerable in preparation, where they may have fewer resources and emergency supplies, before the disaster. Like I mentioned earlier, they may be living in lower quality construction, and so disproportionately affected in that way. They're often in shelters a lot longer, and after an event, finding affordable housing is even more difficult, and rebuilding that affordable housing is very challenging, and at times is not rebuilt at all. So these are just some kind of background thoughts about why housing is particularly important to the study of flood hazards and general sort of resilience plans overall. So with that, I will now kind of dive into a more specific project I've been working on in the Cedar Key area that in part tries to include this focus on housing in a kind of comprehensive look at the area's current and future flood risks. So our Cedar Key project is a partnership between a number of different entities here at UF. We have the Florida Institute for Built Environment Resilience, the Center for Landscape Conservation Planning, the Schimberg Center, as well as some groups in IFAS, the Nature Coast Biological Station, and the Food and Resources Economics Department, alongside Florida Sea Grant and the City of Cedar Key. So it's a diverse project team together. And some of the key folks are Savannah Berry, who is with the Nature Coast Regional Specialized Sea Grant Agency, Jeff Carney, who is the director of the Florida Institute for the Built Environment Resilience, Mike Volk, who is the associate director for the Center of Landscape Conservation and Planning, myself, and Dr. Andrew Ropicki, who is with IFAS, focusing on fisheries economics. We have a number of additional folks in the fiber team: Christian Kaye, who is an assistant scholar and a huge lead on this project, Chung Jai Chen, who's a postdoctoral researcher in fiber, Alejandro Ramos, who was with us previously, and Jess Hayes, who is a graduate research assistant in fiber as well. Then we have a number of people who we are working with in the city of Cedar Key itself. I won't go into all of these details, but I've been really excited for the way in which there's been a close collaboration between both kind of us on the academic UF end of the spectrum, as well as a number of local stakeholders and people involved in local government in the city. And so this project has been funded and developed through the Resilient Florida Grant Program. I bet a number of folks on the call are probably familiar with this grant program. The state has given a number of funds in the last couple of years for communities to conduct vulnerability assessments, where we identify flood risks from flooding and sea level rise, as well as developing various adaptation plans, policies, and projects, and so forth. And so the purpose of this project, it's been about a year or so since that we've been working on it. And we have about, I think, 6 months or so to go. The purpose is really to look holistically at the city of Cedar Key and think about how the city can envision a more resilient future. Through that process, we want to make sure that we build in a lot of meaningful community engagement. And at the end of the process, we want to emerge with kind of more specific steps that we can take action towards building that more resilient future. And so this is the kind of general flow of the process that we've been going through. We have been gathering a lot of data in terms of kind of the community's important assets, as well as the various like flood hazards we want to compare these assets to. We've had a number of community meetings where we get feedback on the assets and information that we're including in the vulnerability assessment. And kind of in an iterative way, we are trying to build towards that final step of the creation of a resilience and adaptation plan. And this can be used both generally to build awareness about flood risk in the community, although having just gone through Hurricane Idalia and other events, I think there is already a lot of awareness in the area. And this kind of plan is also really developing those concrete ideas for action and a mechanism to base grants or other ways to procure funding to try to pursue some of these project ideas. So then the first step of this process was undertaking this exposure and sensitivity analysis. And going into this, we wanted to develop a framework for, what are the values that the city of Cedar Key has in terms of what is important to them. And this is in part guided by some of the FDEP's requirements on, the method that we need to conduct the vulnerability assessment, but kind of also balanced with the kind of important things that the community wants to think about in this planning process. So, for example, the key kind of main goals, I think, in part that they want to make sure extend into the future is that first, that transportation connectivity, that they can still maintain access across all the parts of the city. There's increasingly a concern about affordable housing and where is the affordable housing located versus where are the jobs located. There is definitely one of the top concerns around critical infrastructure, specifically a lot of their water and wastewater infrastructure and how that is already very vulnerable to flood hazards and continues to be so in the future. A focus on ecosystem services and natural and cultural resources, as well as so kind of the community emergency services and all of the kind of local economic activity, including the restaurants, the tourism industry, as well as the aquaculture industry, which really I think gives the island a lot of its identity. So as we gathered all this information, we utilized any kind of state available data, any data that was available from the city. This list started off as kind of shaped by the long laundry list that FDEP requires. And then we had a process of kind of ground truthing that or double checking that with the community through a couple stakeholder and community outreach events. You can see here, we really wanted to make sure that, the things that were important to them were included in the list of things we were conducting a vulnerability assessment of. And so through this feedback, we were able to add kind of a number of, local scale, say like boat ramps and docks and things that might not have been initially on our list, but then we were able to expand out the types of assets that we were considering in this vulnerability analysis. And so then the next step in this process was to really look at how these various community assets and infrastructure were both exposed to various flood hazards and what is kind of the sensitivity of those assets to different types of flood hazards. So this kind of really starts to contextualize, can we identify tipping points, let's say, where we might really want to pay attention to certain flood hazards as being most relevant for certain types of assets, and that can then form the basis of some of our adaptation strategies. So, for example, the kind of foundational background to this assessment in part is Cedar Key's elevation. We know that the area is very low-lying in general, and as we look at the future of the city, some of these low-lying areas are going to be increasingly subject to this long-term increase in sea level rise. And so through the FDEP requirements, we looked at sea level rise under the NOAA 2017 intermediate high and intermediate low scenarios, both at 2040 as well as 2070. And we found that sort of looking at this area over time, it starts to look like some parts of the keys really start to become like particularly vulnerable to this long-term inundation. And these connection points that are starting to be disrupted had a really strong impact on how we thought about framing this project. You can see here we've highlighted kind of these key connection areas that might become or will likely become disrupted over time if nothing is done. And those kind of key breaks then started to define how we framed the geography of the island into these essentially like subsections. And we started to identify, you know, what are the characteristics, both the strengths and the challenges of these various subsections. And you'll see as we kind of progress through this analysis, this framing really structured a lot of the way we thought about the vulnerabilities each area faced, and then kind of guided how we are starting to frame some of our adaptation actions and plans. And so I'm not going to go through all of the vulnerability analysis. It was, you know, tons and tons of slides, but I'll just show kind of 3 key points that I think lead most directly to some of the project ideas and outcomes that we're starting to think about. And so the first one is looking at transportation. And as I mentioned earlier, really maintaining connectivity across the island itself and then to the mainland is really important. And what we see here, kind of looking at some of this flood hazard assessment in a little more detail, some of kind of the main takeaways are that today's nuisance flooding, which is the mean high water, which you see in this kind of brown line, it's going to triple, almost triple in less than 20 years, from affecting less than 10% of the transportation assets, which are boats, ramps, and docks, to 25% in 2040, and then 67% in 2070. Then also looking at a 2-year return event with an extreme high tide, this will affect 75%. You can kind of see that up here in the green, 75% of assets and 30% of the roads, which are mostly located around the city's perimeter. And I'll flip to the next slide. And a Category 1 storm event will flood 61% of the road network within the city limits. And almost 40% of these roads will have more than 2 feet of water, making them impassable. And so what you can see here on this map is kind of a spatial representation of the extreme water 2-year event at 2040. And the areas that are subject to flooding are in these kind of brighter, or rather darker colors. And those are really lining up with the previous areas that we had indicated that were lower and subject to that sea level rise. So here you can start to see, you know, how those roadways become inundated and start to disconnect the city if they are, you know, not elevated. Then thinking about, you know, how could we prioritize, or how do we want to start to think about prioritizing what roads might need some intervention? We started to think about them in the context of the housing in the area and labeling kind of each of these kind of juncture points and how many homes they would be disconnecting. So for example, obviously in the kind of northern area with the main State Road 24, that's going to if that floods, that's going to disconnect all of these sub areas, or 930 housing units. Whereas kind of when you start to go into the city, say if you're at this mid Cedar Key area, this would only say disconnect 130 housing units. So you can kind of start to get a sense of, you know, moving closer northward and eastward. Those roads become more and more critical because they're serving kind of a larger population base. And then we also produce some very simple kind of renderings for our community meetings. It can be obviously a little overwhelming when you see lots of maps and maps, but we wanted to kind of just very quickly and simply paint the picture of, you know, what do these areas start to look like as they do face both these smaller events like a 2-year event, as well as a category 1, and we see the category 3 there as well. So then in terms of housing, again, this is a really important asset for the community, and that they really wanted to maintain kind of an affordable, resilient, and diverse housing stock in order to support the diverse members of the community. And overall, there's Cedar Key is fairly small. There's about 1,000, a little over 1,000 total housing units. Interestingly, there are quite a few more non-homesteaded housing units, which also makes sense. A non-homesteaded unit could be like someone's second home, like a seasonal rental, an Airbnb type of home. There are a few public housing units. You can see all of those in kind of the orange area. So those are a little bit closer to the downtown area. And then there are quite a few mobile home units. And those are particularly predominant in this kind of mid Cedar Key area, as well as a little bit in this kind of more northern Cedar Key area. And then additionally, again, kind of keeping some of the adaptation strategies in mind, we also wanted to take a look at, you know, where were some residential vacant parcels. And so in terms of the sensitivity analysis, we think, or we kind of noticed that there was a key increase in vulnerability over time at a category 1 hurricane, which you can see here in magenta. And so while it affects just about 25% of residential structures today, it will impact close to 42% in 2040, and then over half, almost 60% in 2070. And so if you think about kind of what flood hazard would you want to mitigate homes for, mitigating homes to withstand a category 1 would significantly reduce the flood impacts faced. And so here you can see kind of how this looks spatially. One thing to note, which I think strengthens this assessment, the flood depths that the housing experienced also took into account the first floor elevations of these structures. We purchased that data in order to kind of refine our assessment of what we thought would be vulnerable from these various flood hazards. And so you can start to see these clusters of where vulnerable housing is. For example, you can see a lot in kind of this downtown, a little bit west of the main downtown area. here. There's a lot of kind of vulnerability in this central mid-Cedar Key area, as well as on the perimeter of this western area of Cedar Key and this kind of northwestern area as well. Some to the house, rather some to the south. So there is, a significant amount of housing stock at risk from even just a, Category 1 storm. Here, we just kind of wanted to suss out those details and a bit more specificity for each of these areas. We don't have to necessarily go through all of them, other than I'll just kind of note, a lot of the mobile homes are quite vulnerable. So that's just something we want to kind of be mindful of and kind of think about how we can address that issue as well. Then the last element I will kind of go into is the community services piece. And so here you can see, this is just a number of elements like hotels, motels, mixed use, some supermarkets. A lot of these are located in this downtown area. We see that by 2040, even moderate storms, these 1 and 2 year events in this blue and green, will start to affect twice as many assets as are exposed today. So for example, when a 2 year event exposes a little over 15% of community services and critical infrastructure today, by 2040, this reaches almost 50%. And then again, similar to the housing assessment, mitigating for a Cat 1 hurricane would reduce exposure substantially. And here again, you can see kind of how that looks, that flood risk looks spatially. Then I just hit on some of the high points of our analysis. If you are interested, you can learn a lot more at our web app we've developed at resilientcedarkey.web.app. And I'd like to give a shout out to Chungjai Chen, who has done a ton of work creating this web app. It's a really great interactive tool. You can explore all of the different flood scenarios we have, all of the different time periods, all of the different asset classes, and kind of zoom in and start to get a little bit more into the nitty-gritty details of how different areas are exposed to flood hazards. So just to kind of summarize this vulnerability assessment up, we've kind of looked at each of these topics, one by one, but we know that we really need to look at these topics holistically. And so just kind of overlaying these hotspots, if you will, where areas were more vulnerable. For example, here you can see the sea level rise at 2070, as well as areas of housing that were kind of a hotspot and exposed to other flood hazards. Then we can add in like the areas where the local economy was most affected, the community services, other infrastructure, natural resources. And so this kind of composite picture for us really started to put us on the pathway for framing out these different adaptation areas and the different kind of projects and strategies that we might want to focus on in any given area. And so we had kind of completed this phase of the project when we had the effects of Hurricane Idalia. And so this was, clearly a very devastating event for parts of the Cedar Key community. Actually, before Cedar Key made landfall, Savannah Berry at the Nature Coast Biological Station wanted us to make updates to our flood hazard maps to show both a 7-foot storm surge as well as an 11-foot storm surge. I don't know if you all recall, like those were kind of some of the ranges that were initially being predicted when we thought the storm would kind of hit the coast a little bit further south than what it actually did. And so we kind of made these maps very quickly, and hopefully we're able to kind of give a sense of the possible range of impacts that could be approaching from the hurricane. And so then after Adalia made landfall, we kind of wanted to go to the town and just see kind of what happened. And we saw a lot of devastation along the downtown area. This is where there's a bunch of kind of motels, and just it was very striking. Certainly not all of the area, all the city is damaged, but there was initially a lot, quite a bit of impact. And we just wanted to walk around and get a sense of, what happened in each of these sort of sub areas. And the other component of it is we really wanted to ground truth using this storm, the flood hazard layers, like the storm surge hazard layers we had used in our assessment. And so what we did is you can see here, there's kind of a more clear kind of high water line where this like muddy streak is. So we wanted to go around town and document as best we could all of the high water marks that we found. And so here you can see we just kind of went out and measured these heights of these different structures. You can see it's always kind of this dark line across these different buildings. To me, it was also, this exercise was really interesting because you can start to see the range of different types of impacts, like based on how these different buildings were constructed, these different homes were constructed. So you can see like in this middle picture, this yellow house is, nicely elevated, whereas this peach house, had a lot more impact, it being slab on grade, even though it looks like they tried to put out maybe a little bit of a wall barrier in these sandbags. So the other thing is a slight aside from the main focus of my presentation, but one thing you guys all probably saw was Jim Cantore was on the Weather Channel nonstop, talking about the impacts of the storm as they occurred. And it was really interesting because he was really focused on sort of pointing out areas where buildings were getting flooded and like suffering those, bad impacts. And he, pointed to this building and a few homes. I don't know if you all remember, like he pointed to this white home like 100 times in his broadcast as, the floodwaters slowly encroached into that home. And so I do understand that, like, of course you want to show the drama and whatnot, but I think a real missed opportunity for our profession and communication, like in through a vein such as, the Weather Channel, is to show, for example, on this kind of main picture on the right, there's a lot we can do to prepare ourselves, like simply elevating utilities so that they're above floodwaters. And I would have thought this would have been a great opportunity for him to just highlight where our resilience measures are working well. And so that's a little bit of an aside, but I just wanted to mention kind of thoughts on his broadcast and just how I think all of our collective professions can reach the general public a little bit better. So back to looking at these high water marks. So what we ended up finding is the kind of estimated levels and measured values. They ended up being quite similar to showing that the Hurricane Idalia was a little bit over the strength of a Category 1 storm. I think we were actually pleasantly surprised at like how well the storm surge layers matched up to our high water marks and kind of interpolated flood values. So That storm, I think, is having, as we saw, a lot of negative impacts, but also it is creating an opportunity for potential change in the community. And so in the remaining time, I just want to share a little bit about the adaptation actions and areas that are coming out of this initial assessment. And just to kind of frame some of these big ideas, I think what in part is really underlying our approach is a few kind of key project principles. And the first is that Cedar Key is an archipelago that was historically less contiguous, but restoring that hydrologic connectivity through the island will reduce overall flood risk. Secondly, Cedar Key's natural ecosystems have defined the city's past and will continue to sustain its future, and that these are a critical resource and need to be protected. Thirdly, Cedar Key depends on its transportation network, and connectivity must be prioritized, but this may, how we do that may change into the future. And then lastly, Cedar Key is a collection of diverse districts, and these neighborhoods need to be considered for their individual characters, their strengths, and their vulnerabilities. And so another point to make is that our kind of adaptation actions and strategies are really focused on things that the city of Cedar Key can do specifically. Certainly, there are many things that individuals can do, as well as the state, for example, but we felt the city was the primary kind of focus and user of these recommendations. And so all of our actions kind of center around kind of four main topics where we want to restore Cedar Key's natural hydrology, maintain its connectivity, enhance its ecological infrastructure, and safeguard homes, businesses, and critical infrastructure. And we feel that these kind of collection of adaptation actions can really focus how the city invests its funds to promote long-term sustainability. And so I'm not going to go into too much detail in terms of the technical methodology that we looked at and how we wanted to prioritize these kind of different project ideas. Suffice it to say, we thought about the exposure level of any given asset, the service area, the service extent of that asset, the cost of risk reduction, and the time horizon in which the benefit will be seen. So we kind of had this ranking system. We had a very kind of fine-grained ranking process for all of these different factors. And then through all of that, are summarizing it up into this kind of big main spatial framework for our adaptation actions and areas. And so this all boils down to kind of three main elements, really supporting that infrastructure and redevelopment of structures, trying to embrace this idea of hydrologic flows in neighborhoods where that water kind of really wants to move through, and then creating more green flood buffers. And this diagram is a little bit oversimplified in the sense that I think these actions can occur in many areas across the city. But so just for example, one of the main project ideas focuses on this downtown area, and recognizing that the Cedar Key's historic core is crucial for the city's identity, but it will need to adapt. And there are certainly ongoing projects in this area already that we hope to kind of further prioritize and augment. And so the main kind of big thought process here is that we hope to protect the downtown core by elevating roads and enhancing ecosystems in this Back Bay area, specifically elevating this 3rd Street road to protect this core, this downtown core, and move some key services and assets to higher ground. So what this looks like, again, as I mentioned, is elevating this 3rd Street core, the wastewater plant is located in this area, and we want to move that to the inland area and convert this to a wastewater treatment, or to convert it to a stormwater park. We, as you saw in some of the Cedar Key photos, that City Hall was flooded, and we had wanted to recommend moving City Hall to areas of higher ground by the Cedar Key Community Center. And interestingly, the city has already kind of moved on that idea, and has moved the City Hall and the, I think, fire department or police department to that community center area. So kind of the seeds of some of these ideas are already starting to get implemented just in kind of response to Hurricane Idalia's impacts. Then there would be shoreline restoration along G Street and First Street, improving seawall marina, and elevating or flood-proofing buildings in this historic downtown. And here you can start to see just some preliminary kind of sketches about like what this could start to look like. This is along that 3rd Street transect. And then in terms of mid-Cedar Key, what is better than Cedar Key? Many Cedar Keys. You know, realizing historically Cedar Key was many Cedar Keys, and that over time there has been infill to connect these, you know, certain areas. But we can see that there are, both in our mapping and then visiting after Idalia, there are areas where the water kind of wants to flow through. And right now it's getting pushed up and causing, you know, that inundation. And so the big idea here is to test out, you know, how can we let that water flow through like a larger culvert system or bridges? And then how can we make sure that we are focusing our development and redevelopment on these areas of higher ground? So what you'll see in kind of this mid Cedar Key area are areas where we want to start to like let this water through and elevate this Gulf Boulevard so that we can always have, we can have a continuous connection to or kind of around this area and along Hodges Avenue. This can be converted into a kind of water retention area. We hope to be able to expand and connect to the existing green spaces. The Cedar Key Cemetery is in this area, so it would be cool to connect it across and maybe develop more like trails or running paths. We think, as you can see here, there's in mid Cedar Key, the area is kind of has very undulating terrain where there's high kind of hill areas and then it dips down. And so how can we densify some of these areas with residential properties along this boulevard? If you remember from that earlier housing diagram I showed, there are a lot of like really old mobile homes in this area that are really unsafe. And so how can we just sort of think comprehensively about putting in housing that is affordable and more resilient in this specific area? And then here's kind of a look at restoring that hydrologic connectivity through this area, elevating this Gulf Boulevard. And then lastly, looking at the West Cedar Key area, where we're really thinking about how can we take individual action but have collective impact. If you will remember, this area has a lot of residential properties. It tends to be kind of larger homes that are more kind of spaced out, and there is already some land acquisition projects happening in this area. So how can we keep promoting that through different sort of conservation agencies, as well as help homeowners take actions that will make their property more resilient? So this might be looking at how to make their plantings kind of more salt tolerant, as you know, that sea level inundation occurs slowly over time. Again, like I mentioned, having buyout programs for land conservation maybe we think about a lot next door program, so that residents could purchase adjacent properties, and if they agree to not build on them. This, essentially really focuses much more on that community outreach, communication of future scenarios through visualizations or other tools, so that we can start to think about, that reaching out that critical mass in this West Cedar Key area. And that is kind of just a quick sketch section of what that could look like. And then I am going to try to wrap it all up. So kind of in sum, we're pretty excited about some of these ideas and how these small seeds are kind of starting to plant themselves in the ground. And we hope to kind of build on some of these preliminary ideas and start to finalize things towards the end of this spring semester. As part of this ongoing work, we also have the integration of 2 landscape architecture capstone students who will be doing their final projects on some of these key areas we talked about today. One of our main next steps is a community workshop that's coming up October 28th. Please feel free, if you are interested in this area, to join us. We hope to have a kind of open-ended, relaxed, sort of open house event from 10 to 2, and just do some kind of quick charrettes and workshops with participants. And so, we would love other faculty to pop in or to join or to help out. And then lastly, just again to mention, if you do want to look at some of this least data in more detail, we have our Resilient Cedar Key web app. And so that is, I think we have 8 minutes for any questions if anyone has them.
Thank you so much for that really compelling presentation, Andrea. If you have any questions, please feel free to turn your camera on and unmute yourself and ask them, or type them in the chat. Andrea, we have had some questions about the availability of this slide deck. So is this available on a project website, or can you direct people as to where they could perhaps find a copy of your presentation?
Sure. So I can just send you like a link to like a public, Dropbox, and we can send it out to everyone that way. It's probably the easiest.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. So I have a question that I jotted down. Again, this really amazing presentation, and clearly you're doing such important work in the Cedar Key area. It's so needed. I'm curious, because oftentimes people are very much on board when natural disasters hit, and everybody's got the best of intentions of making things better in the midst of an Adalia. How can you speak to how this effort is looking to sustain resilient building practices, especially amid phenomenon like the growing housing shortage we have in Florida, and how this work could perhaps prevent that hyperbolic discounting of this losing its importance when immediate natural disasters kind of hit the rearview mirror in terms of public perception?
Mm-hmm. I think that is like a very common phenomenon that happens like all the time. There is a lot of interest to start. One, I guess I could answer it in this way. Before when we were thinking about, how can we keep, after our grant is over, how can we keep this going, to the next phase of implementation in some manner? And we had really thought about, okay, this vulnerability assessment is essentially one of the first steps to get implementation from the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, because a lot of their resilience funding helps people to take those next steps. So that certainly is something we would like to pursue in this kind of upcoming rounds of FDEP funding. But also now, since Hurricane Idalia has occurred, there will be more kind of federal funding coming through eventually. There's been, FEMA money to kind of have that initial assistance, and then the HUD CDBG disaster recovery funding will eventually come a little bit down the road, which can be used to, used in communities, not only just to kind of repair what was damaged, but like how to build back better. And we've been thinking it would be really good to have some folks that are in the Florida Department of Commerce and who will be, writing those CDB action plans, kind of to loop them into our planning process so that they can see, like, there's a lot of sort of project ideas already that can be potentially looped into some of these broader disaster recovery funding streams. And just speaking a little bit, my previous professional work had been in Louisiana. Louisiana has been very proactive in using disaster. They've gotten hit tons of times by hurricanes, but using that disaster recovery funding to really galvanize sort of resilience activities. They've done an excellent job of using, that money to think about the future and not just sort of repair and like kind of get back to the status quo. So in terms of a hopefully practical like aspect to your question, I hope that we can have these project ideas infiltrate into those larger funding pots that will come along in the coming years. But I do agree that the tension between affordable housing, building in risky locations, kind of it coming to the fore of everyone's mind after a disaster, and then it sort of trickles away, is a challenge. And I think that's something that will continue to be a challenge in many places.
Yeah, but I mean, again, I think just your presence and the presence of your team in this area again makes the need more salient. So again, just applaud the great work that you're doing there. If there are no other questions, I'm sure that Andrea would be happy to ask any questions you want to ask offline. We'll make sure that we will post the link to the presentation, and this presentation will be also posted on YouTube. I just want to sincerely thank Professor Galinski for a really, really interesting and compelling presentation today. I think it was just so much to learn here. And then thanks to all of you for attending. We look forward to seeing you all at future DCP Research Seminar Series presentations. So until then, have a great rest of the day. And thanks again to our presenter, Professor Galinski.
Thank you, Lisa. And thanks all who came today.
Bye, everyone.